For those who don't know me, my name's Anthony Chiasson. I am the division head of archives in Westmount for the city of Westmount, and I was proposing 4 lectures this year to celebrate the 150th of Westmount. This is the 3rd one. Just for some quick information, the next one is going to be November 7th, and it's going to be there's no title yet, but it's going to talk about Westmount's participation in the war. It's all in the context of like Remembrance Day coming up and stuff like that, so I wanted to do that for this. Today, the last 2 lectures that I gave were mostly academic. Today we're going to go on a lighter side, darker side, hopefully fun side, and maybe not scare too many people around. Hopefully it can scare you guys a bit with the stories. You guys probably know 3/4 of what I'm gonna present today, but it's gonna be for fun. It's spooky season, so I wanted to do something on Westmount's hidden history in the 19th and 20th centuries. So here's where it gets a bit concerning source documents, because as a profession, I'm a historian, so I'm always looking for primary sources and try to stay away from folklore, superstition, even though it's a subject matter that I like. But to give a presentation like this, a lot of basis is on folklore, superstition, oral history. So, and I try to take all this and blend it together with actual historical documents to see if there's any like sort of proof of what's gonna happen or what was said or stuff like that. So source documents for me were a lot of oral histories, City of Westmount, of course council minutes, police archives of Westmount, Westmount Examiner 1940-1980s, all documents from the Westmount Historical Association. They were really helpful with their archive. Anything that has blogs about Westmount, blogs about the history of Westmount, church archives, mental institution applications, oral tradition, folklore, basically newspapers, anything I can get my hands on to actually like accentuate the stories a little bit or try to find some basis of historical accuracy to these stories, to the extent that I could, is going to be presented today. So these are the source documents. But usually as historians, we try to keep it as primary source documents, but this is basically all over the place. So as an introduction, the city of Westmount, as you know, has an extremely rich history. And to kick off the fall spooky season, we're going to examine Westmount's hidden history, dark history. The seemingly quiet, quaint, and affluent city holds secrets that have been buried for too long. It's time that we bring them to light. Ghost stories, bizarre crimes, hidden secrets, seances, meetings, demonic possession are among the themes that will be discussed today. Now, before we continue, like I said before, I have to mention that this lecture is not considered academic in nature. A lot of it resides, like I said, superstition, folklore, eyewitness accounts, belief in the paranormal, even like mental illness. It's like I said, all over the place. But it's going to be fun. It's going to be fun. So we start off with a presentation of big theme is bizarre crimes. One of like the main themes of the presentation is bizarre crimes. So we're going to examine today the case of body snatchers. So, in 1935, information that I found, in 1935, during a luncheon of the Westmount Rotary Club, like a lot of these people I don't know, J. Alex Edmison talked about the ancient art of body snatching and its history in Montreal. All throughout the 1800s, Montreal, like in England and like the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, cities were not strangers to the practice of body snatching. McGill University Department of Medicine required corpses for education in anatomy classrooms. But during this time, it was illegal to carry out human dissection unless it was part of a criminal punishment in Canada. It would happen that if it happens that there was a criminal sentence that would include the act of body dissection, then students were permitted to dissect human bodies in the context of their school and their studies. But because it was rare to receive an executed criminal, professors and students had to think of different ways to get corpses to dissect as part of their education. The only alternative was grave robbery or body snatching. Medical students robbed graveyards and smuggled their bodies back to the university, and we're talking about McGill here specifically. The corpses were exhumed at night and stripped of their clothing and jewelry. It's bizarre, but it was done for the students to avoid any criminal charges of robbery. But they were stealing the bodies on the side. But they left the jewelry and the clothes and the mementos. It was becoming so rampant that the government of Quebec and Canada passed what is called the Act to Regulate and Facilitate the Study of Anatomy in 1843. What is said is that the body of a person who died in the care of the government or a government-funded institution was to be handed off to medical schools unless the corpse was claimed within 48 hours after death. So it did give them more examples of dissection. Anyway, but unfortunately, despite the law, there was still a massive shortage of bodies, and body snatching continued. So many students, they actually paid their way through school engaging in body snatching in Montreal. So when Mount Royal Cemetery opened in 1852, followed by Notre-Dame-des-Neiges in 1854, students saw a lot of money to be made here because there's a lot of bodies getting buried. So the graves were secluded on the mountain, of course, not too far from McGill, and at the McGill campus, sorry, just to be more specific. Bodies were stolen mostly in the winter because burials weren't allowed when the ground was frozen. So the bodies were kept in dead houses in Mont-Royal Cemetery until spring, and then they would be buried. But they would find a lot of instances where they would open up the dead houses and it would be empty, just clothing and mementos that were left. And so it was easy. It was really easy for students to actually steal bodies. And in the wintertime, of course, they couldn't take the bodies and carry them like a normal bag of groceries. So to be a bit specific, so what they did is that they would toboggan with the bodies down the hill in Mount Royal. And it happens in some instances where the bodies would fall out of the toboggan, and I don't want to be macabre or anything, but they would fall out, and people were starting to ask questions, so they were trying to deviate and find different roads to toboggan down because people were starting to ask questions that they would. Some reasons that the newspapers mentioned is that they said it was either someone sleeping in the toboggan or it was their friend that was cold, but it was actually a corpse that they were sliding down. So there were even reports that students, like I said, they used different roads to get the corpses to McGill campus. They took the bodies and passed through what was going to be Westmount in 1874. It wasn't Westmount before, and on their way to McGill campus, so they were getting a bit too obvious going down Côte des Neiges, so they went. They went down with the toboggans, and basically they brought them up and went through Westmount and back down, and they traveled to McGill after, and it was a bit more secluded, a bit more secret, and just on a side note, I know it has no bearing on this, but when I did an analysis of crimes in Westmount in the early 20th century and mid 19th century, a lot of fines were giving out for tobogganing in Westmount. But anyway, so it probably has nothing to do with the corpses. But anyway, there's no reason to give. So what they would do is that to avoid suspicions when they were passing by Westmount, they would sometimes leave the corpses in the snow in Westmount, in the woods. What was considered Summit Woods or coming to be Summit Woods. They would leave them there, avoid suspicion, come a few days later or a day later, the bodies were buried in the snow. They would leave markers, and then they would take the bodies and toboggan down again and bring them to McGill, basically. So Westmount does have a tie and does have a history of being, malgré la ville, the source for body snatching in Montreal. So with different laws being put in place in the later part of the 19th century and early 20th century, body snatching, of course, became less and less frequent for students. Access to corpses for educational purpose became easier. But what remained and where it switched over is that it became where we would call grave robbers. So when students, they stole the corpses for school, like I mentioned before, they would leave the personal belongings behind to avoid criminal charges, and it was even mentioned in certain instances that it was a way to honor the person that was there, but they were stealing the bodies. But anyway, so to avoid criminal charges, but grave robbers that came after the body snatchers would leave the bodies and take the personal belongings. So it like totally switched and it became a crime, and it's a practice that continued like rampantly up until the 1960s in Montreal, and in, like not just Montreal but different cities in Quebec and Canada, mostly small cities for grave robbers. And so that's the first part of the bizarre crime in Westmount. So the next part. The boy who murdered his mother. So on November 17th, you guys probably heard this story before, some of you. And on November 17, 1943, the city of Westmount became the site of a gruesome and horrific murder. A 14-year-old boy named George Webster bludgeoned his mother, to death with a baseball bat after attempting to kill other members of the household. Two of the family members and a woman visiting the family from Australia received head injuries but did not die. Police discovered Mrs. Andrew Webster, the mom, in her bed. An emergency call was made by Miss Sylvia Cuss, the Australian woman that was visiting, who was staying as a visitor, at around 5:30 a.m. that morning. The children, Mina, 12 years old, and Andrew, 8 years old, were found unconscious. George was sitting dazed on his bed, unable to tell a coherent story. This is according to the police reports. The baseball bat was lying beside him, full of blood, of course. It was said that the body remained, but the boy remained dazed and silent after multiple attempts of questioning by the police. The next day, his friends from school came to the police station to see how he was, but they refused access to the boy. The detained boy was in the ninth grade at Westmount Junior High School and winner of several awards as a pianist and not a pianist, but a pianist at hobby shows. His friends were interviewed. They said that he was acting kind of funny, in quotes, lately, and recalled that he had been punished twice within the past month or two for being absent at school without permission. In 1944, George Webster was declared unfit to stand trial by two psychiatrists, or at the times they would call him alienist. They reported that while he was detained, he was heard laughing uncontrollably, giggling, then becoming silent, moving, running, then becoming completely still and not moving for hours. He was ordered to enter a mental institution. What happened is that there's absolutely no record of him until 1951. At the age of 22, George Webster was released and acquitted for murder due to insanity. And I tried finding more info, all the sources that I could consult online or primary sources to figure out what had happened to George Webster, and there's absolutely no trace of him, except there's one little trace I'm going to speak of at the end that I might have found a clue to, but I'll speak of it at the end, which this is where it gets bizarre after. The next story, it's boy murdered. It's another bizarre crime. On Sunday morning, October 27, 1901, the city of Westmount awoke to horrific news. The night before, around 6:30 p.m., Eric Aline Marotte, a 7-year-old boy, was brutally murdered by Thorvald Hansen, a drifter from Copenhagen. He had been roaming the Montreal streets for several days looking for work. Not the boy, but the suspect. That Saturday afternoon, Eric Marotte attended his first and what was going to be his last dance lesson at Westmount Dance Academy. Upon leaving the school, his friends recall hearing him juggling some coins in his pocket. From the academy, the boy headed to his grandmother's house located on Green Avenue. He left there just after 6 p.m. for a short walk home, never to be seen alive again. His family lived at 31 Hillside Avenue at the corner of Hillside Lane, close to Westmount High School. descending Metcalfe Avenue, St. Catherine Street, in that area. The boy always took, coming home from his grandmother's house, a popular path which cut through the northeastern corner of Metcalfe and Hillside. It was on this pathway that he encountered Thorvald Hansen. Hansen accosted the boy and demanded his coins in his pockets. The boy refused to give him his money. This is where Hansen murdered the boy. He was found in an alley just a few hours after he didn't make it home by his dad. Hansen made his way to the police station right away and confessed to the murder. There is no record of Hansen, he confessed to the murder, but I couldn't find any documental sources to see like what type of sentence that he had or how much time he spent in prison. But this is where this story gets a bit weird. Recently, maybe like a year ago, I do a lot of pictures in Westmount. And I bring people because it's old, there's old streets, old buildings, and I do a lot of like fantasy photography, and I was taking pictures with a model in particular, and this model believes that she can see dead people. And I remember her explaining something about a boy she was hearing, whatever. So I contacted her this week, and I said, do you remember this boy that you heard when we were shooting? And she says, yes, of course, I can't forget him at all. And she explained to me, like I said, do you have any details that you can explain to me of like what you heard, what you saw? That she was seeing a little boy walking the streets with his hands holding behind his ears like this, and she was hearing jiggling sounds from his trousers. And I said, like, okay, and what kind of jiggling? Like, she mentioned coins. I didn't mention anything. But where it gets even more bizarre is that the details of the murder of the boy is that, like, I don't want to go into macabre details, but this is important for considering the paranormal aspect of the story, is that the boy was stabbed with a knife on both sides. And like I said, he was jingling coins, 17 cents in his pockets. So, and she is adamant, this person, that she saw the boy walking in Westmount with trousers and gingling, chain was gingling, and he's walking like this in the street with period clothes. So, like, do we have around St. Catherine, Metcalfe, Hillside, a little boy the ghost of a little boy walking around? I'm going to leave everyone to judge, or maybe check at night if they can see anything. But like, she's adamant that she saw it. So, which I find interesting because I was researching this exact same thing. So, now to the next one. Theft and love. This is more of like the lighter side. No murder, no specters, no ghosts, nothing paranormal. But I found this really interesting story in the archives of Westmount Historical Association that I just found pretty cool considering. And it has to do with crimes anyway. So sometime around 1906, it was reported in the Montreal Star the story of a beautiful Swedish girl that worked in Westmount as a domestic. The young woman named Hilda, if I pronounce it correct, Joberg, was accused of having stolen a few items from her employer in February 1906. Valentine's Day, she appeared in court to answer for her crime. Around 10 a.m., police magistrate Edmund McMahon walked into the council chamber, not council chamber, but the judge's chamber, the court chamber, and took his seat on the bench. He saw the very distraught woman in front of him. Tears were flowing from her eyes. When the judge was about to impose his sentence to this woman, an attractive gentleman stepped forward and offered to intervene on the young woman's behalf. His name was William Brown. He was 22 years old at the time. He declared to the judge that he was willing to pay any fine for Joberg on Joberg's behalf if the magistrate let her go. Let her go free, basically. The judge turned to the attractive young man and asked, why? Are you in love with this woman? And he answered, I am smitten to the very heart with her sight, at first sight of her. I do not want her to go to prison, he answered. Do you really love this girl? The judge asked again. The magistrate asked again. I love her with all my heart, answered the young gentleman. Would you marry this young lady? The magistrate asked. I would marry her on spot if you liberated her, he added. To everyone's surprise, Judge McMahon made an arrangement then and there. He requested the indulgence of Reverend Ernest Bushell, rector of Westmount St. Matthias Church, to perform the wedding ceremony. The couple were married that evening on Valentine's Day at 7 p.m. And which, like, this, it was reported in the newspapers, but this is where, I had to do a lot of detective work to see if, I checked every available resource that I could find to find these two people. Censuses, phone book records, police records, anything. There is no trace of this couple after that day. So, is it something that was reported, as a joke in the newspaper? Even police records don't mention this. So, but I still found it interesting, even if it didn't exist. So it's a nice story of love at first sight. That was pretty cool for me. So now, bizarre crimes are done. Some of the bizarre crimes are some of the most bizarre crimes that I could present. Now we're gonna jump to ghost stories in Westmount, and there are a lot of them. I just had to pick and not explain or present 15 ghost stories in a row. I tried to choose the ones where either there's a sensible scientific explanation to the outcome, no explanation, something more recent, or anything that could be extended to the original story. So you guys might know all these stories already, but there's the case of Murray Hill Park ghost in King George Park. There's always been rumors that Murray Hill has been haunted by a group of children that were spotted singing while running and playing in the large green space in what you would call period clothing. They are locally called the musical children's ghost. According to some sources, like some of you might know, Murray Hill, King George Park, First Nations graveyards were in the vicinity that were found in the early 19th century. In 1898, an ancient native burial ground was discovered at Murray Hill or King George Park. Many of the skeletons were found buried in fetal positions with their knees up. But returning to the ghostly children, a lot of people that played in the park at night or at sundown would hear right on top of Murray Hill, just what seemed to be children singing, and singing religious songs, religious hymns, and no one made anything of it. But the story had its fair share of criticism because there's no actual. It's bizarre to say this, but there's no actual proof of anyone ever hearing them sing. It was like a bit of hearsay and whatever. One explanation, one possible explanation is maybe children from the St. Matthias choir. That's what people were hearing when they were practicing or playing in Murray Hill, or what was going to be King George Park. But that's and they were mistaken as ghosts, maybe by someone or some people. But that's the more logical explanation, because from that story that came out that the Murray Hill was haunted, there has been no other instance in existence in Westmount that someone was playing at Murray Hill or King George Park and heard people singing, children or specters or ghosts or whatever. So I'm more content if it's a mistaken in identity, but I still found it was a cool story to at least investigate. This one is pretty interesting here. It's Westmount's Old Dance School, and this is more recent. We're not talking about the 1940s or 30s or whatever here. This is close to 2007, 2008. There's a group in Montreal called the Montreal Paranormal Investigators. I don't know exactly the name, but it's a group of people that go out and investigate hauntings in Montreal with specialized equipment and a bunch of infrared cameras and whatever. And their group is called the Montreal Paranormal Investigators. So, it's the story of a 150-year-old house At first, it was a dancing school that got closed down, reopened as a theater. The house was bought after by a wealthy family that still owns it today. A lot of renovations were done in the house, years and years of renovations. But witnesses, before the Montreal paranormal investigators came in, witnesses had reporting seeing, like on the house, if I can just go back here, on the top right corner, the window top right corner, witnesses were seeing a dark figure walking in the window, back and forth, all night, just going back and forth like this, and would disappear, and then would reappear 5 minutes later doing the exact same thing, going back and forth in the window. And from what the stories say and from what the eyewitnesses say, there was nobody in the house at the time because renovations couldn't be done like at midnight. There was no one in the house. But the lights, for some reason, there's probably a really good explanation, but the lights were always on, 24/7. The lights were on in the house. So there's even a witness that saw someone in the window that resembled a man and that had burning or flames coming out of his arm, and all of a sudden he would disappear and come back, and it would be the other arm that was burning with flames. And so they decided, the Montreal investigators in January 2007, they decided to go see for themselves. They parked in front of the house and they started taking pictures of the house. And they actually noticed the dark figure in the window going back and forth, but what they noticed more is that the figure was going back and forth, and all of a sudden the figure, when it was in the window, the figure, like around the belly area, would light up like a big ball that would light up in front of them, and then it would disappear. So you can see, I didn't want to show the pictures because they're really grainy and stuff like that, but you can actually see, like from frame to frame, it would be like the dark figure, then the next picture would have the light on him, on the dark figure, and the next picture it would disappear, and there's like a frame of like a few seconds or minutes between each photo. And and after that, after they saw the dark figure with the lights, the figure would become transparent, and it would become like what you would call it's like shiny, bright, like fluorescent light around them for some reason. And they saw a luminous figure after that changed colors. In the 60-plus photos that they did, within minutes, in another window, another luminous figure. They had no explanation. And they came back regularly to take pictures and noticed again the dark figure, luminous figure in the window going back and forth all the time at a certain time at night. And just to make sure they weren't going crazy, they brought some of their friends over and they saw the exact same things, according to their accounts, of course. And one day they came back with an infrared camera and recorded like a video of the figure in the windows, or the figures, but mostly the dark figure. And like they said, the object was swinging back and forth sideways and standing at the window looking outside all the time. And the density of the camera and the energy from the infrared camera, what they said is that it changed a certain color, and that shouldn't be if no one's there. And after that, they just left the investigation how it was. There was no continued investigation in that figure, and even up to today, some people that were in that group still go visit the house and they still see it, according to their accounts. They still see the figure, but there's actually a family living there right now. So that I found, it was a cool story that I hadn't heard before for Westmount. And the next one, of course, you probably heard about it, is, there's one missing. It's Trafalgar Tower. The Trafalgar Tower ghost. So for people that aren't aware, perched on top of a steep slope, it was located in the valley between Mount Royal and the peak of Westmount. It was a Gothic-style tower that was commissioned by John Ogilvy, and who had purchased the land in 1805 and named it Trafalgar Farm. The tower was built by James Gillespie, John Ogilvy's protege. It was intended to be an architectural showpiece highlighting John Ogilvy's fervent British loyalty. However, after his death in 1819, the tower began to crumble and developed a creepy reputation. Rumors started circulating that the tower was haunted. Visitors reported hearing phantom footsteps in the area close to the tower. A common legend referred to a strange old hermit who used to live in the tower and speculated that it was him that was haunting it. In another story, because there's a lot of stories that coincide with the tower and a lot of ghost stories throughout the centuries anyway. In another story, a local toll gate keeper named Quinn was scared to death after one of his cows had strayed away and wandered towards Trafalgar Tower. His account of the events are stated here, and I'm just going to cite it. It's better if I cite it. I just had found my cow at the foot of the haunted summer house and saw with my two eyes a beautiful form of a woman looking out of one of the windows. I was transfixed to the spot that I could not take my eyes off the vision. She was in white and her hands clasped as if in prayer. Looking upwards, I remember falling down on my knees and crossing myself, and I remembered nothing more. So, one of the most bizarre tales about the tower is that it was haunted by a pair of young lovers who had been murdered on sight by a jealous suitor. After his advances were rejected by the young lady, it's said that the man chopped the two lovers up with an axe. And since then, the two lovers have been haunting the tower. But the most prominent story I found in the whole Trafalgar story ghost tower is that has always been true to its form. It's the footsteps hearing by numerous visitors that on the tower. They always hear footsteps and footsteps and footsteps while there was nothing there, nothing around them. So according to one teenage girl who lived most of her life on Belvedere Road, and I quote, "The weird sound of the footsteps is pretty normal in our neighborhood. You can usually hear the invisible feet walking when it's very quiet when you're alone, like in the early morning or after sunset. I've heard them many times." When asked her theory about the mystery, the girl explained, "I don't know. For as long as anyone can remember, we've heard these unusual sounds around the area of the tower." So that's one for Trafalgar Tower. The next one, and I think is the last one for ghost stories, if I'm not mistaken, is the haunted cottage. This one is... This story was taken in part from a blog that is written and kept up by Michael Walsh in Westmount, and this touches the archives of the city of Westmount directly. There's a painting that was given to the city of Westmount with an accompanying note of a tale of ghosts from the haunted cottage. So the story occurred on a plot of land named Sicyon Lane, later named St. Catherine West or part of St. Catherine West. And the best part I could do is that instead of summarizing what happened, I found it way more interesting to just read the actual letter that was given to the city that recounts this ghost tale. So, and I quote the letter, I was going to start to quote the letter. "The little cottage was probably the original house on the farm known about 1850 as Helliwell Farm, which is now the MMA ground, so Montreal Athletic Association. It was at the time used as a residence by a farmer of the name of Robert Wark, who later added the old Selby property to his farm and resided in the Selby house, now occupied by Mr. R.W. Kerr. In the 50s of the last century, it was occupied by the coachman of Captain Dunford of Green Height, Patrick Bushell, and his wife and family. Who lived in it immediately before him, I have no recollection. This is the note that was given by the owner of the painting. Shortly after, tales went around that a peddler had been murdered there. But I could never trace anything more than the vaguest of rumors. But the ghost was supposed to draw chains around the garret. I think the man was more frightened of his wife, and he told me that one night when they were sitting on the stoop looking out the grounds, a light appeared about 100 yards in front of them at the side of the stables, And while they were watching it and wondering what could be a tremendous blow was struck on the side of the stoop, and they fled into the house. I frequently accompanied him down the lane, which was a very pretty one, probably somewhat over half a mile in length, only about half a dozen houses the whole way. One night when the ghost was more than usually present, they got so frightened that they picked up their children and fled at the neighbor's farmhouse occupied by a connection of theirs. When they got there and told their story, there was a wild young Irishman by the name of Michael McDermott who jeered and laughed at their terrors, and using frequent free language, said he would like to see the ghost that would turn him out. He wasn't afraid, so he wanted to see the ghost. They said that if he would go back with them, they would give him a room to sleep in. It is not known whether he intended the challenge to be accepted or not, but he could not very well back out, so back when they went and turned him into a spare, they went and turned him in a spare room in which there was a bed for visiting friends, and they returned to their slumbers at the original house. However, they had not settled down, in fact, that they had not yet asleep before woeful cries arose from their space room of, "Oh, Pat, come quick, bring a light. He's pulling the clothes off me." Pat got up, lit a light, opened the door, and found McDermott in a state of terror. He said that he would not stay there any longer, so he took up his mattress and laid it down on the floor of the room in which they were all sleeping together. And all was fairly peaceful till the morning. Anyhow, they finally got so terrified that they gave the house up, and of its later history, the later history I know nothing, but it was still there at the time, and the MMMA, so Montreal Athletic Association, took possession of the ground and pulled it down, which laid the ghost eternally. So, and this we have it in the archives with a letter accompanying the painting. So that's it for ghost stories. So now we're going to enter mystics and seances in Westmount. So just to give you an idea, in case no one knows what a seance is an attempt to communicate with the dead. Some or even most of us have heard of the famous Ouija board. With the rise of spiritualism in the 19th century, mostly in England and transferred to North America, the desire to communicate with deceased loved ones became more and more popular, still is today. They would be what we called mediums that acted as bridges between the living world and the world of the dead. Montreal, and specifically Westmount, were not excluded from this practice. Numerous family archives and journals mention attempts at connecting with the deceased loved ones, but the one that I want to explain is the most popular one that has to do with Dan Aykroyd, the actor, that has a long history of his family being mystics and spiritualists and seances and ghosts, and that's where someone took his inspiration for Ghostbusters is the stories of his family that you probably already know. He described the spooky things that he heard and saw as a child that inspired the film. His great-grandfather, Samuel Augustus Aykroyd, was a well-known mystic during the peak of the spiritualism craze in the 19th and early 20th century, and used to host seances in Westmount frequently. His son, Peter Aykroyd, spent his childhood watching his family's parlor seances through the crack in the basement door, and wrote even a book called The History of Ghosts, True Stories of Seances and Mediums and Ghosts and Ghostbusters. And in 2009, in an interview with CNN and Larry King, Dan Aykroyd elaborated, and I quote, "When I was 8 years old, I attended my first seance, and our family has been interested in the whole thing during my whole life. My uncle, he told a story about coming into a room in Westmount, Montreal, where they held seances all the time. There was a trumpet flying in the room, and it was speaking, and there were voices coming out of it. As soon as he came in, it dropped to the floor," end quote. Even the practices of seance, even having been debunked as charlatanism in the 20th century, there's still some that I hear of today in Westmount and in Montreal that are self-proclaimed mediums and have seances going on to this day in Westmount. Now we're going to end on a high note with demonic possessions. Okay, so just to explain a bit, this is where I'm mostly specialized in my field in history. I dealt a lot with with demonic possession exorcisms. It's one of my specialties when I did my PhD, and I transcribed a lot of exorcisms. I dealt with a lot of exorcisms, and but just to give you an idea of what an exorcism is, if you don't know, of course, it's a specific form of prayer that the church uses against the power of the devil. So why does the church need an exorcism? There are instances when a person needs to be protected against the power of the devil or demonic figures, or to be withdrawn from spiritual dominion. At such times, the church asks publicly and authoritatively in the name of Jesus Christ for the protection or liberation through the use of the exorcism rite. So, when and how is an afflicted member of the faithful referred as to an exorcist? What happens to end up in this ritual, basically? It is advisable that every diocese establish a protocol to respond to inquiries made by the faithful who claim to be demonically afflicted. As part of the protocol, an assessment should occur to determine the true state of the person. Only after a thorough examination, including medical, psychological, social, psychiatric testing, might a person be referred to the exorcist of the diocese for final determination regarding demonic possession. To be clear, the actual determination of whether a member of the faithful is genuinely possessed by the devil or a demonic figure is made by the church and only the church, even if individuals claim to be possessed through their own self-diagnosis or psychosis. There are no set lengths of how long a rite of exorcism lasts. It's to be noted too that 99.9999999% of people described as being possessed turn out to be suffering from any type of mental illness. However, there are a few that reach what we call, in quotations, church intervention, which means that the rite will take place to exorcise the demonic force or forces that took over the body of the faithful. We cannot attest to the validity of these two cases becoming full-on exorcism, but these cases that I'm presented to you, which are private in nature, there is no information on like who gets exorcised in Montreal or in Canada, unless it makes the news, but it's mostly private matters. But I found two cases that are pretty cool. First attack, about 2 years ago, the child became bad-tempered, will throw things at her mother, occasionally laugh foolishly, complain of hearing voices who tell her to smash things. She said people are trying to harm her, and she banged her head and pinched herself all the time. She talks to herself. At times, she strikes her mother. On December 26th, there's no mention of year, she smashed a Christmas tree and threw things at her bedroom wall because demonic voices were coming through the wall. She has spoken of suicide, but has made no attempts up to now. She smashed a Christmas tree and tore it to pieces. The patient is somewhat evasive, suspicious at times, and at times threatening. She has numerous ideas of biblical reference and misinterpretations and some delusions of persecution. She has hallucinated and responds to these hallucinations by becoming destructive. It is impossible to care for her home as at the hospital. Church intervention is recommended. And this is where, like, I can't validate that this became an exorcism, but from a ton of experience, like transcribing exorcism, because I'm that old, so I was transcribing him instead of typing him in university. So I was transcribing him by pen. But from like every exorcism case that I worked on or studied, when church intervention is mentioned, this is basically the last stage. So because what we can hear here is that she's being taken care of by medical professionals, and they're actually giving an account of what's happening to this child. And if psychiatrists or back then alienists decide that church intervention is recommended, this is basically first stage to get to the diocese and do what needs to be done for the rite to be executed by the parish or the diocese exorcist. But again, can't confirm it. I don't have names. Private matters concerning the church. I just have what was transcribed by the medical professionals. And the second case is a 15-year-old, and these two cases are in Westmount. They're not like Montreal, they're Westmount cases. 15-year-old was placed in a private ward in Saint-Jean-de-Dieu Hospital. Became changed in character, restless, erratic, continually moved hands and feet, made grimaces, would sing or scream, would run out of the house, and would knock on doors continually. I don't want to, it's not funny, but the child gazed fixedly at objects, lie for hours in bed with legs drawn up in fetal position, does nothing and shows no interest in anything, has a empty gaze in her eyes. The youth has failed in weight and strength very much. Is very thin now, formerly 160 pounds, looks shocked, fatigued, always lies in bed on the side, legs drawn up to the chest, does not move, does not answer questions, and appears to be influenced. It is recommended that the church be invited to care for the youth. So again here, typical stuff, whether you believe it or not, whether there was an exorcism or not, I can't confirm, but when you see signs of like massive loss, weight loss, signs of fatigue, like if you go and you Google exorcisms and you put like symptoms or whatever, there's a lot of documentation out there, you're going to see the exact same thing like these two cases. Whether it finished that it was mental illness, maybe so, but like from just seeing small references like this to the church is that they were beyond their means. The medical professionals, they were beyond their means to deal with these two cases. So probably the only option left was exorcism. So in conclusion to all these stories of ghosts and seances and demons, are they based on reality, or are we seeing a mix of reality, folklore, superstition? The city of Westmount, as you know, is extremely rich in history. Maybe as the spooky season comes upon us, we might start to reflect that there might be more that went on here and is still going on than we know or want to know. I'd like to thank everyone that came today, researchers that have contributed to these stories, like members of the Westmount Historical Association, Montreal Haunted blogs, different authors on the history of Westmount. And I would like to leave you guys with two snippets of stories that I didn't have time to research for this presentation. I couldn't find a police report, but I know it exists. It's just that we have like tens of thousands of documents. So in the beginning of the 20th century, Westmount police, and I'd seen this report just by flicking through papers a few years ago, feared that there was what we refer today as a serial killer in Westmount. They had found two bodies flipped over with legs pointing up and their head into a bog or into a swamp or something like that. But like, I would like to research it one day and go further, but I would like to find that police report, that if there's any like conclusion to this. And also, having worked a long time ago when I was studying, I was working for a diocese, basically on the search for religious relics in Quebec, but mostly on the South Shore. So I was like going to churches and searching for relics. But there's a rumor that there's a Catholic church in Westmount. I found this in my notes, researching like 15 years ago, that's housing important religious artifacts that no one knows about. So, and my notes end there. So I have no clue what it was, or I would have to go through again and maybe search a presentation that I had when I found like Saint Zenon's relics in a church, but like this is something I would like to touch on later on. So thank you very much. I hope you had fun, and thanks.